Hello and welcome one and all, blessings on you and your families. How is everyone today? My name is Grandpa Elroy and I'm the official keeper of secrets and truths at the North Pole, and I am an elf. I am also the official storyteller of the North Pole, and do I have a new one for you today? Santa has finally grown tired of all the false rumors out there and false stories and movies of him using reindeer. It just ain't true. Santa's reindeer is a giant hippo that's blue and her name is Vixen, and today I'm going to tell you her story. It all starts 3 years before the first Christmas, in a small city not too far from where Santa was born. Of course Santa didn't move to the North Pole till year 3 of Christmas, but that is another story. And in this small city lived a greedy rich man who only wanted to get richer. He wanted to draw more people to his town and marketplace so he could make more money, so he hired a circus with animals that no one in that country had ever seen before. They had lions, tigers, bears, rhinos, giraffes, gorillas, hippos, buffaloes, and many other exotic birds and small animals. It was all the talk, all the wonder at first, but after a time the people stopped coming, and a lot of the animals didn't take kindly to the cold weather. It was that last bleak winter of the circus when Vixen was born. The rich man had been selling off the animals to private collectors, hunters, and even restaurants with owners who wanted to buy meat by the pound, like with the buffaloes and hippos. It was on the way of Vixen and her parents to be delivered for food when a blizzard hit that lasted for 2 days. By the time it was over, everything was covered in snow. A few days later, when things started to thaw out, a man, who in less than 3 years would become Santa, was walking into the village that was near his house when he noticed a very sad sight: those poor hippos and horses frozen in the snow. He stood there a moment to shed a few tears. What is that? Are there rats already feeding on the hippos? No, it's something else, and it's stuck under the hippos. So Santa gets some branches to leverage the hippos, and out comes crawling and squirming and crying, a baby hippo. It was Vixen. Her parents had used their bodies to save her life. She was too big for Santa to carry, so he used most of the day to build a wheelbarrow from some of the parts from the cart. Santa is a very skilled builder. Some say magic guides his hands when he builds toys for children. Santa then took Vixen back to his home, but Santa didn't know the first thing about hippos, so he sent a raven with a note to his old friend Valgar. Valgar is the chief of the last tribe of elves that lived in hiding in the mountains north of Santa's home. By nightfall the next day, Valgar had shown up with his daughter Helen, who fell in love with Vixen upon first sight and begged Santa to let her be Vixen's caregiver. So she started taking care of Vixen and nursing her back to health. At first Vixen was very sad over the loss of her parents. She thought she was all alone and barely ate her food. Helen tried everything to get Vixen to smile and eat or play with her. She played peekaboo, she played music, and tried to get Vixen to dance, but Vixen just ran away crying. Helen tried bringing Vixen toys like teddy bears and soccer balls. Vixen would just stare at her with a blank look. Then after a few weeks it came time to give Vixen a bath, and Helen decided in order to get Vixen up out of the little pool the elves had made her in Santa's shed, she would try her own favorite fruit, watermelon. She brought 3 big juicy watermelons and set one at the edge of the pool, and one where she planned on scrubbing Vixen down, and one she slowly placed by Vixen in the pool, and then she walked away and waited. Vixen just stared at her. Helen waited as the watermelon bobbed up and down for the first 5 minutes. Then it settled in next to Vixen and she finally looked over at it. As Helen waited she hummed softly, just loud enough for Vixen to hear her. Finally Vixen was hungry as she finally sniffed it. Then she licked the watermelon. Then she opened her mouth and chomped down on her watermelon. Some of it came squirting out the side of her mouth. It made Helen giggle and Vixen looked at her as if surprised by the sound, but it didn't stop Vixen from eating the watermelon. And then looking at the edge of the pool where the next one was, slowly Vixen made her way to the watermelon. Again as Vixen chopped down on the watermelon some squirted out her mouth. And again Helen giggled, and this time when Vixen looked at her she smiled ever so slightly. As Vixen headed over after the last melon, Helen readied her scrub brush and soapy water. Just as Vixen started to eat the last watermelon, Helen started scrubbing Vixen. And to both of their surprises, Vixen liked it, and even leaned in a little to let Helen know to brush a little harder. After a nice long scrubbing and not forgetting to rub Vixen's belly, Vixen and Helen looked deep into each other's eyes and knew they would be best friends. Vixen and Helen would spend much of the next few years side by side. Just like on the first few days of Vixen's first spring, the two of them would have one of many little adventures. Vixen and Helen were running through fields of fresh wildflowers just behind Santa's house, smiling and laughing, as they raced towards the creek at the back of the field, where the forest started. Of course, Helen let little Vixen win by pretending to trip just before they got to the creek. Vixen let out a loud hooray as she jumped into the creek, but she was quickly backed out again as the water was still winter cold. They walked along the creek looking at the little fish and tadpoles in the water, the birds chirping in the air. After a time, the creek bent to go back in the forest and Helen said it was time to head back, but Vixen saw a rabbit in the forest and wanted to see what other cute animals were in there. Helen said another time, and just as they turned to leave, they heard the scream for help coming from up the creek in the forest, and then a loud cry with more calls for help. Vixen was scared. Helen told her to wait there while she checked it out, but as her best friend Helen went along the creek deeper into the forest, Vixen slowly followed, and as they came around the first bend in the creek, they could see two human children crying and pointing in the water. Their puppy had fallen in, and they were too little to save it. So Vixen rushed over and jumped in, swimming to the puppy and letting the little soaked thing climb on her head. As she swam it over to the kids, who were overjoyed at not only having their little puppy back, but at getting to see and hug and climb on Vixen, who was their new hero. The four of them played together with a puppy for hours, until the children's parents came looking for them 'cause it was time for dinner. The four of them played many afternoons by the creek on the side of the forest, sometimes hide and seek, others they would just sit and watch and listen to the animals. As spring turned to summer, Vixen, who was not yet done growing, had doubled in size. And now that it was summer, Vixen was ready to try a new treat. Her friend Helen would talk about when she would tell stories of camping and campfires. She wanted to try s'mores, so it was a few days into the summer that Vixen, Santa, Valgar, and Helen set out for a clearing, a few hours into the woods, to set up a camp. A nice spot by the creek that Valgar and Helen had gone to every year since Helen was 5. She was 139 that year, just a preteen in elf years. As Santa and Valgar set up camp, Helen and Vixen went down to the creek to go for a swim. After a few minutes of splashing, and then a race from one side to the other, Helen and Vixen decided to lay back and float, and watch the clouds and try to figure out what they look like. Of course, Vixen, being a hippo, was a natural floater, but Helen had to tie together several water skins she had filled with air to help her float. As they floated, they called out what they thought the clouds looked like. "There's a lion," Vixen called, "and a swan over there," said Helen. After a while, they looked up and noticed they had floated way down away from the camp, so much so that they couldn't see it, and weren't sure how far they had gone. They climbed out of the water and decided to listen to see what they could hear. Maybe Valgar or Santa setting up camp, but nothing. They figured they better head back before the adults get worried. But just after they had taken a few steps, they heard what sounded like a little screech and a scream. What was that, they wondered? There it was again, and it came from the other side of the big tree that was right in front of them. Vixen was scared. She was shaking. Some of the elves had told her of old monsters that lived in the forest, but Helen had told her most of the stories weren't true, and the few that were hundreds of thousands of years old tales of old world things that are long gone. But it was all she could think of at that moment, a monster. And then it came around the tree, or more rather fell around the tree. Helen rushed to pick it up and keep it from hurting itself even more. It was a baby snow owl with a broken wing. Helen used a little of her elf magic to calm the baby, and started rocking it and singing to it. As they walked back to the camp, they learned the baby's name is Rose. She was born in the wrong season for her kind, and the barn she had lived in with her parents had burned down, and they had got separated. Then a falcon had tried to get her. That is how her wing got hurt. and that the falcon was scared off by her two new heroes, Helen and Vixen. As Helen told all this to Valgar and Santa, Vixen's face turned all red because she knew she had been scared, but now they were all safe eating s'mores. Vixen and Helen spent most of the rest of the summer working with Rose as she healed, and got ready to fly again. Finally one day in the fall she was ready and she took off in the sky. She was gone so long that Vixen and Helen worried she wouldn't come back, or worse. But just as they were about to go back inside there came Rose, and she told them all she'd seen, and most interesting was this little village not too far away that was preparing for a festival or holiday. Rose wasn't sure. Helen knew it was time for Halloween, and both Rose and Vixen wanted in on the fun. So Helen promised to take them. Helen told them how you dress up in costumes and they decided to do a group costume. Vixen would dress up as a reindeer, and pull the sleigh, and Helen would dress up as a fancy lady, and Rose would be a little butler. Just before they left, Santa wanted to give Vixen a present he made for her birthday. He knew it was early, but he felt it would look great with her outfit. It was a big red shining lightly glowing bell, that he and Valgar had crafted and engraved with protection and a few other charm spells. And they had crafted a white gold chain so she could wear it as a necklace. She swore it was so beautiful she was never taking it off. As they paraded down the main street of the little village where the festival was, Helen would introduce them as, "My driver Rudolph the red-belled reindeer," she would say as she pointed at Vixen. "And this is my butler Krampus," as she pointed to Rose, who had insisted she have horns like her hero Vixen and a cape like her other hero Helen. "And I am the saint of peace and joy, come to bless your happy festival." It was such a grand time for them all, except a little mishap at the end of the night, when a man who had had a little too much to drink almost stepped on Krampus, Rose. She then flew into the sky, causing him to fall over, dropping his lantern and hitting his head. Luckily the fire caused by the lantern was only a tiny bush, and the man passed out right there unharmed. When he woke the next day, it took him 3 days to find his kids. They had gone to his sister's house on the other side of the village, and thus started the legend of Krampus taking kids and what would later be Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. Again, those are other stories. Today we are talking about Vixen. When that next winter came around, Vixen went with Santa as he visited several villages in the area to trade supplies. Santa had also brought with him a few toys he had made to try and sell. But the reason they had to go to several villages is because it was hard times. Just to get the supplies to last through the spring, no one village had enough to share or sell or buy toys. Each village gave what they could, and Santa paid them and gave each of their kids a toy. That made Santa smile so big and laugh to see the kids smile who barely stayed warm and barely ate, to give them some joy in this world. And as they went village to village, he had never seen it so bad, it made Santa so sad. Vixen went home and told Helen all about it, and they told Valgar and Santa that they had to do something about it, especially since Helen was a saint of peace and joy. Vixen teased her, and that made them laugh. But what can we do, they thought. It wasn't until that next spring, when they were once again outside playing with their human friends in the woods by the creek, that they came up with what to do. It was late spring night, almost summer, when Vixen and Helen were rushing back to Santa's house to tell him and Valgar their great plan. They explained that their friends had a cousin in one of the villages where a couple of the kids had got toys, and they were hoping you would make them some toys. But Vixen and Helen wanted to make enough toys to give to all the poor kids that lived in the area. As they said it, a few tears rolled down Santa's cheek. Vulgar had spoken up and said with elf magic he and his kin could make enough toys for all the kids in this country in a couple of days, he bragged. At this, Santa chuckled because he knew there was no way to say no to his loved ones, especially if it was for helping others, if only to have a little faith and hope and joy. They decided that next year, midwinter trek trade, that instead of 6 villages they would do 30, and all the country kids in between those villages. With a little help from some elf magic and magic Santa and Valgar had put in Vixen's bell, they could do it all in one night. And no one would know who did it. But as with all great plans, nothing goes perfect until you have a few years' practice. So they showed Vixen how to use a couple of the spells in her bell. One to turn invisible, not only herself but any sleigh she is pulling, and anything or anyone in it. And how to move very, very fast, and how to freeze time. And that it was very important not to abuse especially this last power. Valgar and Helen had made a red cloak for Santa, one that would allow him to turn any size he wanted to. And they made one last bag, promised never to be made by the people again, 'cause it could be used for evil. But this one time they trusted the spirit. It was a big red bag of holding. You can put anything in there and everything in there, and it's like it's gone, but the owner of the sack calls to mind what's in the sack he wants and reaches in, and out comes what you put in like out of thin air. So on that first non-Christmas, the original trial run, that they were seen several times that night. Like when Santa was sneaking back out of a house, instead of shrinking to fit out of the cracks in the door, he grew and tripped over his foot and knocked the front door off the house. Valgar, who was hiding outside the house, quickly used his elf magic to fix the door, but not before the man of the house got a glimpse of Santa getting in the sleigh, before Vixen used her magic to move on to the next house. Or just a couple of houses later, when the front yard was icy and Vixen bumped into the front of the house, waking everyone, and Santa was seen by everyone in the house, 3 kids and parents, who Santa put to sleep with a little sleeping powder. This is how the rumor of "you better be asleep when he showed" started. And then there was one where they thought everyone was asleep but peeked in, and a little kid saw Santa picking in the window, and this is where "Santa is watching us" comes from. Or when they were about halfway done and finishing the last house at Village 15, when a pack of dogs started barking, and half the village swore they seen something. A lot of red and fat was thrown around there for years to come. As the tales changed and grew, not all good, not all were happy. At first some adults didn't like a man coming in their house at night. This is the reason that in just 2 years from then Santa and all the elves will move to the North Pole. But that is another story, and I said, this is a Vixen story. Vixen and Helen and Rose couldn't wait to play with their friends that next spring, and hear them talk about their toys, but before that they had work to do. Santa and Valgar worked with Vixen on how to use the flying spell they had put in, using elf magic and the magic of Santa's saint hands. They also decided that next year they would do the whole country, and who knew, maybe someday the whole world. But next year they would settle for their country, and that would put in concrete the legend of Santa Claus, but not poor Vixen, and this is her story we are telling today. One thing she knew was that a night of bringing happiness and peace and joy was hard work on her. She was tired and sore, and then came the training for next year, and she felt like she had just got done training for this year. But she was determined and ready day in and day out with very little whining. Santa and Valgar seen this, and they said that 2 weeks before Christmas that they would send Vixen and Helen and Rose to the spa for a week to relax and get pampered. Vixen's only question was what was a spa, and oh how Helen laughed and said only a woman's best friend a spa day. But Vixen looked her straight in the face and said, but you are my best friend, and I'm not yours, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Helen, still smiling and trying to hold back her laughter, said to Vixen as she grabbed her face, a spa is not a person, it's a place. Just wait, you'll see, we'll have so much fun there, just us girls. And then that made Vixen and Rose happy and jump for joy. Oh how Helen was right, the hot bath, the massage, the stretching, the food, the steam rooms, the place even had a lazy river the girls spent hours every day in. Vixen was in paradise. None of them were ready to go, a little sad to leave. But then they thought of how their human friends have been so happy with their gifts, and promised to always keep their friends' secrets, and how much they wanted to do that for so many more people. And after Santa, Vixen, Helen, Valgar, and the last tribes of the elves moved to the North Pole, things were great for many years. The area grew year after year that they covered along with their stories. It wasn't until a few years ago when Vixen went to check in on some of the descendants of the children she played with as a kid. Her and Helen had kept up with them and their family down through the years. And it was at one such stop by that she heard as she peered in the window. It was an elderly man telling this to his grandchildren. We've all heard the story of Santa's reindeer. Well, it just ain't true. Santa's sleigh is pulled by a giant hippo that's blue, and instead of antlers on top of her head, she has a bell around her neck, and as her red bell rings it glows, letting out Merry Christmas notes everywhere she goes. She moves ever so fast and she is super light on her toes. From rooftop to rooftop she hops, seemingly dances as she goes, and loves to play in the snow and turning herself into a snowman. She is a pro. Didn't you ever wonder who helped Santa eat all those cookies and gobbling them down? She is no rookie. Chasing them down with eggnog and hot chocolate and extra chocolate and marshmallows on top of it. There is only one thing she loves more than cookies and snow, and that is a good scrubbing by Santa's elves, just so when they're done she is aglow, especially if they get her underbelly. It makes her eyes roll. And if you're wondering, her name is Vixen, and at pulling the sleigh she has only one conviction: to make children happy, and if you try to stop her she will get real scrappy. When she is not at work she loves to spend her days napping in her pool. Just a thought of sleeping in her bed made her drool. When she is not eating cookies she is eating fruit. Her favorite is watermelon, brought to her by her best friend the elf Helen. Out in the snow she loves to play running, chasing the elves at least 1 hour a day, and when they are done she is ready for bed. Another Christmas delivery dancing in her head, children laughing and playing with toys she helped deliver. One thing is for sure, Vixen is a blessed giver. Vixen loves Christmas, and Santa, and you, so smile thinking of Vixen so shiny blue. One last thing Vixen wants you to know. Be good this year, or come Christmas, your house, she just won't go. Remember, Vixen is praying for you and all your happiness, just so. Merry Christmas. As he finished his story, every face in the house was aglow with happiness, and Vixen couldn't keep the tears of joy from rolling down her face. But as she flew home to the North Pole that night she grew sad again, like she hadn't been in years since she was a baby, because most people didn't know the truth. When Vixen got home she met up with Helen for a cup of hot chocolate as they were talking about what Vixen had seen that day Santa walked in. And a few minutes later Santa said, "By God, you are right, it is time to end all these false rumors of flying reindeer," and at that they all had to laugh. Well children, this is where today's story's over, but remember to come back, cause next time Grandpa Elroy is going to tell you the story of Helen the Saint. Have a blessed day, and remember, Grandpa Elroy is praying for you.